Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to second webinar from Cloud Optics. And in this webinar, we'll be talking about SEC guidance, which has come out recently. And we'll see what SEC guidance is on public company cybersecurity disclosures. Once again, very warm welcome to all of you. So first, few housekeeping items. Anytime if you have a question, please click on the question button on your screen and feel free to ask. We'll take up all the questions at the end of the session. And a copy of presentation slides will be provided to all attendees by email. And feedback, please do not forget to leave the feedback. It's very important for us to hear what you think about the feedback and any other topics which you would like us to cover, and then we can look into that as well. My name is Asim, and the brief profile, and it's a brief thing about myself, and a varied experience in IT industry, going from Fortune 20 companies and startups in Silicon Valley. So it's a pretty wide ranging. Now let's dive into the. So this is our, if you can recall, on a first webinar, which when we talked about a fictitious company, where Jay was a CISO and Bob was infrastructure director and John was CIO. And in first webinar, we talked about Jane, CISO, and her challenges in digital transformation and in the company and so on, and impact of cloud as far as cybersecurity goes. And today we'll take up John's case. Now, John is CIO, and by virtue of his role, he has dual responsibilities. So dual responsibility, by which we mean, on one end, he has internal stakeholders like employees and his organization, his reportees, etc. And on the external side, he, along with the CEO, reports into board of directors, right? It's a publicly traded company, and they report into board, and they have external facing stakeholders like shareholders, maybe activists, public, SEC, and so on. So there are a myriad of stakeholders which they need to communicate to as well. So that's a dual role which John has. And that brings its own challenges. So now let's look into the context here, some of the things which have been going on this year and last year. We have seen a slew of breaches and ransomware and other cybersecurity incidents here, starting say maybe from a where data breach, 57 million records were compromised. Equifax, of course, takes the crown here for this year. Yahoo, etc. And then there are, if you see some of the numbers in the center of the screen, we're talking about Merck, FedEx, Maersk, and Equifax. The cost of the breaches is pretty high. Breaches and managing them and controlling them is pretty high, totaling up to $1 billion right here. So what the environment today looks like, where frequency, magnitude, and cost of cybersecurity incidents is becoming a material risk to public companies. Now, the key phrase in this statement is material, and we'll get into it a little bit in more details, and we'll dive into it and see what that material means and how does it relate to SEC and what the guidance is and what public companies should be doing about it. So that's from a context point of view. Now, we will spend a few minutes in understanding a bit about SEC, what SEC is, what does it do, and why SEC is concerned about cybersecurity threats and why now. So that's the thing which we will look into right now. Now, SEC is Security and Exchange Commission, and it's an independent federal agency which was created by an act of Congress in 1934. And their main job is to regulate the securities market. And they also need to see the orderly functioning of capital markets. So they need to see whether the trust is restored to the public side, there's no manipulation or fraud going on, those kind of items which SEC is most concerned with. And they have broad sweeping powers to do so. To regulate that, they can ask for record, they can order investigations, they can impose penalties, and so on. So they're very, very wide-ranging powers to impose on their companies and any company which is traded in public stock market, right? And even on the private side also, they have wide-ranging power and they regulate a lot of financial industry like advisors, etc. Now let's look at why SEC is concerned about cybersecurity threats. As we saw in previous slide, what we are seeing, experiencing in the wild over there is that there's a lot of incidents. Their cost is increasing, which means it requires the public participating in the stock market and the capital market scenario to get the full and timely disclosure. So that's one of the mandates. This is how SEC tackles the regulation of security market by promoting public disclosures by the companies and the full disclosures, accurate disclosures to have the trust and not have information asymmetry between the management of the company and the investors at large. And this is how they protect investors and keep the faith in the market of fairness and robustness. So because of these threats becoming material in nature, where the value of the value at stake, they call it VAR, value at risk, is becoming very high and becoming substantial in relation to the listing of the company's stock in the market. So which is why they are focusing it now than in earlier point in time. The frequency and magnitude is increasing quite a bit. So that's SEC, right? Now, to solve that cybersecurity challenge, SEC has provided guidelines now. And SEC's chairman, Jake Clayton, issued an advisory and a guidance in 21st Feb 2018. And if we see one of the notable things in today's assertion is that they want to promote clearer and robust disclosure by companies about cybersecurity risks and incidents, resulting in more complete information being available to investors. So the idea here is to provide the information to the investor in as complete fashion as possible. And in that regards, SEC is urging companies to examine their controls and procedures and how they are disseminating that information, how they are fulfilling those obligations to the public and investors. So that's the context here and what SEC is trying to achieve. There was an earlier guidance in 2011, but it did not cover a lot of other challenges. And these two new challenges topic has been added in this guidance, which is number one, importance of cybersecurity policies and procedures. So how these cybersecurity policies and procedures, etc., are implemented, conceived, and are serving the interests of investors here. And the second is provision of insider trading within the context of cybersecurity. So if we notice, you might have read in the news that Equifax incident, some executives sold their shares while the information was not public, right? And public did not know. So they sold their stocks and booked profits, which will not be possible going forward because that erodes the trust factor in public market functioning. So that SEC has come down very strongly on it. They're very clear. They want to stop these kind of practices, and this behavior will not be tolerated going forward. So that's the purpose of SEC guidelines here. Now, let's look at the information type which needs to be disclosed here. So they are asking for material information. Material meaning any information which an investor will like to consider while making the investment decision, either to make a new investment or evaluate existing investment. So that's the material part of it, right? As may be necessary to make required statements in light of the circumstances under which they are made, not misleading. So as the information becomes available, executives are, in this case, John has the fiduciary responsibility to disclose that information to the investors, and it should not be misleading. It may not be complete because it's maybe sometimes evolving information, but it has to be accurate and it cannot be misleading. Now, which information Commission considers to be published, right? If the key operating phrase here is substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider the information. So if there is some information which is relating to cybersecurity and there is a substantial likelihood that some investor will consider that information, right, important enough to make an investment decision, then that information should be put forward in public domain, and public has a right to know that. And that information cannot be omitted or concealed. It's a bit of a gray area here, but we expect going forward this becomes a little bit more prescriptive than just a guidance as it is right now. And it's like a directional statement what they want to see happen, but not necessarily they're still putting the exact wordings of you should do A or B. Now let's see disclosure approach here, what SEC's guidance is. Their approach is actually risk-based. So they are not expecting companies to disclose specific technical information about the cybersecurity systems, networks, etc. What, for example, what kind of antivirus systems do we have? What kind of update policies we have? How long do we run the updates and so on? And what is the frequency? Because this kind of specific technical information will compromise a public company's position in cybersecurity space, which can be exploited to inflict damage. And that's clearly SEC does not want to see happening. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of that is that any internal or external investigation cannot form the basis of avoiding the disclosure. So just because there is some investigation happening, internal or external, maybe some work is going around, forensics, etc., but that will not form a basis to avoid disclosure just because it is under investigation. Companies have an obligation to correct the prior disclosures in case new information becomes available and it requires that previous stated information needs to be kind of updated here. So that's the second key approach here. Third aspect is that it's a company by company approach, which is relevant and material. So it is not something one size fits all. and every company will have to decide based on their own business and their own ground realities what is reasonable and what is material and relevant. So based on those criteria, companies will have to make a decision and disclose the information and disseminate to the investors. So these are the key areas how this SEC sees these companies approaching it. Now let's look at the SEC guidance. Given the approach and the intent of SEC, what kind of issues to consider at this point in time? So let's look at the first issue: litigation, investigation, remediation, cost of cyber security incidents. So this is some of the criteria which SEC recommends to evaluate when companies are putting together the guidance or a disclosure, right? So litigation is any kind of maybe a class action lawsuit is going on with respect to cybersecurity, or any other investigation which is going on, and remediation of that, right, incident which has occurred already. So cost related to those aspects. So to give you an example about, say, remediation, right? So there is a cybersecurity incident has happened, consumer data has been compromised. Now, in order to remediate that, certain customers needs to be contacted. There may be credit monitoring report services, etc., need to be enabled maybe for a year or two. PR agencies needs to be hired. There is more communication happening from the company side, management and executives, maybe board members, etc., to the public at large via multiple outlets, etc., to kind of repair the harm and assure the public in general. So those all the costs according to that, I mean, under that kind of head, which can be attributed to cybersecurity related, will come under the remediation cost. So that's one of the cost heads which needs to be considered. The second is the impact of existing and pending laws on cybersecurity. So, for example, GDPR is a good example, or maybe some other laws which are pending at that point in time earlier. So now GDPR is definitely in effect. But earlier, when they were being considered at that point in time, the guidance would consider those issues while disclosing the material information, because of this new change in law. You might require to implement many new systems together, or some other business practices needs to be changed, and that impact that might have a disproportionate impact on the revenue or the profitability of the company. So that becomes a material information, and hence needs to be disclosed to the investors in a timely fashion and accurately. So that's the impact of laws here. Now let's look at potential for reputational harm. So that reputational harm could happen because of the any cybersecurity disclosures, etc., depending upon what the magnitude of the incident is and other factors. So management has to consider whether this has a reputational harm potential, and then based on that, they can include that into the disclosure that they're making to SEC. Cost of maintaining cybersecurity is definitely one of the challenges. So how cybersecurity is being maintained on a continuous basis, how they are the cybersecurity is implemented, monitored, and that will be keeping existing systems and tools and products, processes up to date. Is what will come under the cost of cybersecurity maintenance head here. And that cost also needs to be considered for this particular guidance and disclosure. Then aspects of business and operations giving rise to material risk. So there may be certain aspects of business operations, say for example, third-party vendor onboarding, which requires maybe a smaller checklist and a due diligence portion before they get onboarded, right? And that aspect alone may give some risk for a cybersecurity incident. If third-party systems are connecting to our networks or maybe to cloud assets, etc., and that means that there's a risk which is getting introduced here. So those aspects needs to be evaluated. There could be hiring practices, how much background check we are doing, how deep we are doing, and so on. So those business practices also may lead to cybersecurity incident as well. So those issues can be, it needs to be looked at. Now, preventative action taken and the limitations. So those are some of the preventative action which corporations can take with respect to cybersecurity, and what are the limitations. So those are the issues which need to be carefully evaluated. So this is a little bit tricky one, because if we are disclosing the limitation, we have to be a bit careful so as to not end up disclosing our vulnerabilities publicly. So that's the preventable thing which we need to kind of keep in mind. Now, probability and magnitude of impact of the incident. So that's also which needs to be considered carefully while disclosing to investors. What is the probability of these cybersecurity incidents, and what is going to be the magnitude of that? And similarly, on the occurrence side, how many times it has happened, prior incidents, and what was the severity and frequency. So those aspects needs to be considered, all the issues, while coming up with the disclosures from the company. What is our guidance? So our guidance is that there are 5 steps to adherence with this SEC advisory, guidance actually. The first step, it's an iterative process, not a one-time work which we can set up and we are good and compliant. It's not like that. It's going to be an iterative process, and we have to keep optimizing and improving on it. Now, first step is risk analysis, and this can be done by our enterprise risk managers and other stakeholders in calculating the business risk, how we categorize the risk, how we classify it, and what is their prioritization is, what is the impact of incidents for this risk, and what is the magnitude going to be if it happens, it materializes. So those good old practices of risk management needs to be considered, and based on that, risk prioritization matrix has to be come up with. So this is a qualitative analysis of the risk here from a readiness point of view. Then the very important aspect of disclosure control processes and reporting automation. So by this, we need to evaluate what cybersecurity controls are applicable, what kind of disclosure controls which we need to put in place, and most importantly, how do we automate that? So certain aspects of information, it's a top-down approach where based on what input the board needs to make the disclosure, or our CIO needs to make to the board internally, those aspects needs to be automated and streamlined. And that will make the information available from the systems and IT controls, cybersecurity controls and processes to the CIO, and then a business call can be taken to either move forward with certain information or not. So that's something which needs to be done. And then, of course, there are technical and operational considerations like continuous cybersecurity visibility and assessments, which needs to be adhered to maintain the posture and security. And of course, the measurement of tracking of and tracking of cyber exposure. So we need to have an objective measurement of what our cyber security posture is and how we are moving on that front over a period of time. Whether we are improving, we are staying the same, or we are degrading is something which we need to come up with internally for our own businesses and calculate how much risk do we have on the cyber exposure side based on our IT assets. So this is an iterative process, a five-step process to adherence, and that's what we are recommending to our customers. And now let's look at technical and operations considerations here. Once we have understood the SEC challenges and all approaches and the guidance, now we look at what are those considerations from a cybersecurity professional point of view. What can we do to help customers and stakeholders there? So that's we need to see continuous security and visibility. We know if we cannot see, we cannot secure. So that's the first key area where it must be visibility is the key here, and that has to be on a continuous basis. So this, if we take an example of an IT assets over here in today's world, what we are seeing is that there's a very diverse assets comprised of multiple clouds, etc., and AWS, Azure, and so on. Now, if we look at that AWS, Azure, etc., that's kind of they are not talking to each other, right? Their terminologies are different, and how they secure their own environments, etc., are completely different. How customer utilizes and interacts with them is also very different. So that's where sometimes it gets lost. How what the information is and what it means and how to translate that information gets lost, and that results in less visibility into the entire assets. And cloud has also multiple services, like AWS has more than 120 services, and similarly Azure has a lot many assets as well, services, and combined together it becomes very, very difficult to have an eye on that on a continuous basis and have the visibility which we need from a business point of view. So that's the challenge here. Now, measuring cyber exposure objectively. So as Seth Godin has said, if you measure it, it will improve. So if we put a process in place and we try to measure it, and then we measure it continuously, then of course we are going to improve it, because there's a feedback loop which we have set up, which is a measurement. So what we need to do from a technology and operations point of view is define our cyber exposure objectively and then measure it over time, so we can find the posture, what our cyber security posture is across the assets, across the tool sets, across the processes, etc. So that way we can have a comprehensive view of our cyber exposure, and we can take steps to fix that. How can Cloud Optics help? Cloud Optics can help in multiple ways, and most importantly, Cloud Optics modules like insider threat prevention, compliance visibility, cyber exposure index, and continuous security assessment and remediation help put the operational rigor in place on a continuous basis to have this kind of SEC disclosure guidance, etc., in play, where it can help in that direction. There are some of the references from where we took the information. You can always refer to them. So that brings us to end of the presentation today. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks a lot for your time. At this point in time, I'm looking at any questions from the audience. If there are any, you can take that up. All right, so there is one question which has been asked. So how does Cloud Optics help? Right, so yeah, from Cloud Optics point of view, we help in creating continuous security and visibility, right? And if you see in today's environment, the world has changed. Earlier, if we take an example of, say, file servers, we used to have file servers. And if there are any kind of challenges or misconfiguration on the file server on the access side, then the impact was pretty limited because we still have corporate firewalls to protect us from outsiders and so on. And internally, not many people will snoop around to find what the free access available on which server and which files, etc. However, in cloud is completely different. If we look at AWS S3, and if there is a misconfiguration on the bucket, which is a rough analogy for, say, file server, that's where it will be exposed to the world. And if the data is sensitive over there, then pretty much organization data is compromised. So that's one of the examples. And that's how Cloud Optics can help keep everything aligned on the technology and operations point of view, providing continuous visibility and monitoring. So that's all for today. Thanks a lot for joining, and we look forward for your participation in subsequent webinars. Thanks a lot.